Well, I'm really excited to be here with these two women whom I've actually just met, but I've studied their books. So we're going to talk about what we talk about when we talk about rape. And I was thinking about how to introduce the three of us, and it just seems like we wear many different hats, but all of us have taken something deeply personal and then broadened it to a whole universe, really. So one has written about, has started from the personal experience of being raped by someone she loves. One has written about women being raped in war, and I have written about gang rape by a stranger. So they're all three different aspects of a crime that is very rooted in everything, really. So what we're going to do is we're going to make some connections, and I can't think of a better way to express that than something Tarfia wrote in one of her poems. She's written, "In West Texas, oil froths luxurious from hard ground, while across Bangladesh, bayoneted women stain pond water blossom." Just showing us that all these things are connected. So we're going to start off with everyone talking or reading for about 5 minutes from her own work, and then we're just going to converse and then have some questions. So go ahead.
Hi y'all, how's everybody? Hello, is this on? Okay, I see. It's good to be here, though. I have to say that I don't like to talk about rape. I don't want to be here talking about rape. I wish the word rape didn't exist. I wish the concept of rape was not something that we had to have such back and forth about. But I'm here nonetheless because some years back, I became very invested in the stories of Bangladeshi women who had been raped during the 1971 Liberation War. And I spent a year in Bangladesh researching that crisis and also interviewing women who underwent that tragedy. So I write poetry, and I'm going to read a few poems from the sequence that's in the middle of my first book, and they're poems written from the perspective of women who have undergone these atrocities. And also, I suppose, my perspective a little bit as an interviewer comes into play here too. The title of the sequence is Interview with a Birangana. Birangana means war heroine. It is the term that was given to women who were raped after the war was over. And the only other thing I'll say is that the poems written from the perspective of the Birangana are, they begin with a question. What were you doing when they came for you? Gleaming water sweeps over Ma's feet, bayonets, teeth. My green and yellow Eid sari flaps damply between two palm trees. Grandfather calls to me, Mishti Maya, girl of sweetness. Ashi, I call back. I finish braiding my hair, tie it tight. I twine a red string around my thigh. That evening, a blade sliced through string, through skin, red on red on red. Kutta, the man in khaki says. It is only later I realize it is me he is calling dog, dog, dog. Where did the Pakistani military take you, and were there others there? Past the apothecary shop, shut down, burned flat. My heart seized, I told it to hush. They saw its shape and weight and wanted it too. Past the red mosque where I first learned to touch my forehead low, to utter the wet words blown from my mouth again and again. Past the school draped with banners imploring, free our language, a rope steady around my throat as they pushed me toward the dark room. The silence clotted thick with a rotten smell, dense like pear blossoms, long strands of jute braided fast around our wrists. Yes, there were others there. Interviewer's note. You walk past white high-rises seamed with mold, past a child wading through drowned rice fields, one pink blossom tucked behind her ear, past yourself rippling a storefront window. Victim, noun, one that is tricked or duped. Past a woman crouched low on a jute mat selling bangles. One that is injured, destroyed under any of various conditions. Was it on a jute mat that she gave birth to the baby, half his, or his, or his, or his? Victim, a living being sacrificed, past smoke helixing from an untended fire, past another clothesline heavy with saris. For hours they will lift into the wind, hollow of any bruised or broken body. Would you consider yourself a survivor or a victim? Each week I pull hard the water from the well, bathe in my sari, wring it out, beat it against the flattest rocks. Are you Muslim or Bengali? They asked again and again. Both, I said, both. Then rocks were broken along my spine, my hair a black fist in their hands, pulled down into the river again and again. Each day, each night, river, rock, fist. The river wanders this way, breaks that way. That is always the river's play. Interviewer's note. You listen to the percussion of monsoon season's wet wail. Write in your notebook, bhalo me, kharap me, choto sundari, bad girl, good girl, little beauty. In Bangla, there are words for every kind of woman, but a raped one. I'll stop there.
Hello, I'm Lacy Johnson. So my third book is called The Reckonings, and it's a book of essays about justice, because my second book was about rape, and specifically it was about the time that I was raped and kidnapped by a man that I had been in a relationship with. And he got away, and that's been almost 2 decades now since that happened, but it took me a really long time to write about it. So my book, The Other Side, is about that. And while I was, touring and reading from The Other Side, I kept getting the same question over and over, which was, what do you want to have happen to this man who did this to you? You probably want him dead, right? And I was so surprised by that question and by the answer that everyone assumed that I would give, because I don't want him dead. But of course, that's the only model that we have for justice in this country, which is you do something bad happens to you, and therefore justice. But that didn't seem like justice to me, because if the equation is you make someone suffer and then you must suffer, and we're invested in symmetry, I wanted to work toward a different kind of symmetry, because this actually just means perpetuating violence on one another over and over and over. Violence perpetuated on me, violence perpetuated on you, violence perpetuated over and over and over ad infinitum. And so a different equation that I was interested in and invested in is if you extract joy from the world, you should have to put it back in. And so I decided to write and think a little bit more about that. And I'm going to read just a tiny little bit of the title essay called The Reckonings, which hopefully teases some of this out a little bit. And the only thing I'll just say is that usually the person who asked the question was a woman who sat in the back of the auditorium. This woman, like every other woman who asked the question, sits with her back to the wall, like I do when I have the choice, or near the door in the last row of every auditorium. Sometimes she is my mother's age, or my age. She wears oversized sweaters, little makeup, pulls her hair back in a simple bun. She does not want attention. She has children like I do, and like I do, she sometimes struggles to love them well. She will tell me this after I finished answering questions when I am sitting at a little table signing books. She has a story that is similar to mine in ways, and she doesn't even know what to feel about it anymore. Sometimes the woman sitting near the door or against the wall is an old woman with crepe paper hands. Sometimes she is not a woman, but a man. An old man my father's age in a 10-gallon hat who tells me he was raped by an uncle when he was the age of my son. Or the person who asked the question is a man young enough to be my son if I had started much earlier, who tells me the question is for himself or for his girlfriend. They both have a story like mine, he says, and they have not yet found an ending to it. I am surprised at how the people sitting near the door in the last row of the auditorium always have a story like mine. I carry these stories with me because I don't know what else to do with them. The details may differ. If it is not the story of an abusive lover, perhaps it is a mother or a father or an uncle, or it is the story of a friend who has been killed by a stranger while trying to do the right thing, or a woman who is shot in the back of the head while asking for help. It might be a story about the abuse of power or authority, of the slow violence of bureaucracy, of the way some people are born immune from punishment and others spend whole lifetimes being punished in ways they did nothing to deserve. In my story, there was a man I once loved very much, and because of the self-destructive way in which I loved him, I didn't want to leave him when he abused me first with his words and then with his fists. I told myself I could fix him, that this wasn't who he was, not really. I let him keep showing me who he really was until I finally believed him and left. I had already lived a few lives by that time, I thought. A farm girl from Missouri, a door-to-door steak salesperson, a sex worker, a model in New York, a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault. But I was afraid none of these lives had sufficiently prepared me to live the one I wanted more than anything else. I had only just begun thinking of myself as a writer around that time, but I told myself I had probably not read enough books, had not visited enough continents, was not smart enough or wise enough, didn't have anything to say, and no one would want to hear it if I did. I thought there had been a mistake in the cosmic register. Somewhere there was another Lacy Johnson who could keep straight when to use lay instead of lie, who actually belonged in all the places I began finding myself, who deserved all the good things that suddenly seemed to be happening to me. This is all to say that the worst violence that man committed was not against my body, but against the story I told about the person I believed myself to be. I was 21 when that man kidnapped and raped me and tried but failed to kill me. The man got away and I got away. He is a fugitive living in Venezuela, and I am a writer of books. The last one I wrote was about him, about the day he meant to kill me, but I lived. It was not easy, not the writing and not the living, not until I often found myself standing in front of strangers telling them there is justice for me in standing here in this room, alive and breathing and telling my story with my own voice. It is not the ending to the story anyone expects, not even the one they want, because they want a return, a redemption, a retrieval of all I had lost for my part in the story. They want suffering for him. They want blood, guts, gore. Now that would be justice, they think. I'll stop there.
So I'm going to tell you the story of how my book came about, because since it's right there in your face what it's about, I should say it. So I grew up in India, and when I was a teenager, my family moved to America. And just after I graduated high school, I went back to India for the summer to spend it with my father and my grandmother. I was 17 years old, I had just graduated. I was 3 weeks away from college. And I had gone for a walk with a friend of mine, a boy, and we were kidnapped and gang raped by, we were caught by 4 armed men who threatened to kill us. They wounded us both very severely, and they threatened to castrate him, and they did rape me. The idea being that if I didn't let them rape me, they would castrate him and kill us both. So that happened. It was horrible. And then we went back home, and then really unexpected things started to happen. I had grown up in India, a country where no one at that point ever talked about rape at all. But I somehow missed that message. And I grew up in a family where I didn't get a lot of those toxic messages. So the minute I went home and my father found me and said, what shall we do? Shall we call the police? And I said, yes. So we called the police, who were every stereotype you can ever think of being terrible. And we ended up not being able to press charges. In fact, I almost got locked up myself. And then 3 weeks later, still in bandages, I went back to America and started college. Which was actually the saving of me, because I could tell myself then something that I know now is not true, which is that rape is out there. It happens on the mountain, it happens from strangers, it has nothing to do with the rest of life. Then 3 years later, I decided to do my senior thesis in college on rape in India, thinking, oh, this is so interesting. I'm going to go research it and find out about it since I now have some experience. And I went back to India expecting to basically find lines of victims at the door waiting to talk to me, but no one talked to me. And in fact, it was explained to me that rape is in fact a Western concept. We don't have it here. And if it does happen, it's a particular kind of class-based thing. It's the same myth in America, where the myth is that white men rape black women. In India, it's landlords and policemen rape tribal women. Otherwise, middle-class women are not part of the equation. So I did somehow end up writing my thesis on rape with very few people to talk to. And then, while I was there in India, remember, I was just a teenager, and I was full of fire, and I could not understand why everybody kept saying it doesn't happen. I knew that if it happened to me, it must have happened to other people. So I wrote a piece for a feminist magazine in India and about my own rape, and I published it with my photograph. So remember, there was no internet in 1982, so I felt pretty safe doing this. And it came out in India and created a bit of a stir, and that was that. And then I went on and lived my life for 30 years and carried on and fell in love and worked and did all these things that people do and had a fantastic time and thought I had dealt with this. Though I did work with rape academically and professionally, but not all the time. Then, I'm sure you all remember in December 2012, the Jyoti Singh murder that happened in Delhi, where a woman was gang raped and murdered. And at that, for the first time really in Indian history, the whole country was obsessed with this topic of rape. It was amazing. I think something changed then it's kind of the genie will never go back in the bottle. I don't know if there's ever going to be any less rape, but it will never be quite as taboo as it was before. So I was in New York feeling very excited about all the consciousness that was happening, all the people who were marching, even though some of it made me really uncomfortable. We can talk about vengeance and how disturbing it is when you're the victim. But I thought this had nothing to do with me. But it turns out that the media, being the media, they wanted to talk to someone who'd been raped. And in all these 38 years, 35 then, I think, still not a single Indian woman had ever come out and said she'd been raped. I was still the only person, but I lay low. But then somebody found my Manushi article, the article I'd written, and scanned it and posted it on Facebook. So it went globally viral. I got the shock of my life. All the people in my life who had no idea this had happened to me knew. We had to tell our kids. It was just a huge worldwide thing. The media kept calling. And then I decided that as a writer, I was a bit embarrassed by what I had written as a teenager, and I wanted to write a piece 35 years on. So I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and that went globally viral, but that I was happy about because I felt like I controlled it. It wasn't that somebody else had taken something I had written. So I was very happy about that. I got 1,000 emails from women and men all over the world telling me their stories. And I thought, now I'm really done with rape. But then, every time, meanwhile I've published several novels and I had a newspaper column, I had all kinds of things, but every time I went to an agent and said, how about this idea? They would come back and say, will you write a memoir about rape? But you see, for me, writing a memoir would not, I've read yours, it's fantastic, but I'm not the person to write a memoir about rape because I really didn't feel that it's sort of the linchpin of everything that happened to me. So it didn't seem right for me to write a memoir about rape. So I always said no. And then a couple of years ago, I wrote to Penguin India with what I thought was a fantastic book idea. And she immediately wrote back and said, can you write a memoir about rape? And I was so irritated that I wrote her a real stinker about all the reasons why I wouldn't do this. And rather than going away, she wrote me back this really intelligent email saying that, you've been thinking about this issue for 30 years. You've dealt with it in ways nobody else has. Why don't you just write a book about it? It doesn't have to be your memoir. And so then I wrote this book. And it was just so fascinating to write it because really the title should be What We Don't Talk About when we talk about rape. Because in some ways, the fact that, for instance, I started writing it and I had it was kind of no holds barred because I thought not a single person is going to read this book. Because there was no Me Too. Me Too started a few months after I started writing it. So rape was not a topic that anybody was talking about. So I just let loose. And I started to realize that now, even after Me Too, we talk about it in all these forums, but we still are really weird in how we talk about it. For instance, we talk about rape as if it's like the weather. Women get raped. It's like women get struck by lightning, or women get abused, or children get... But someone actually does it. There's a person who rapes, there's a person who makes a choice to rape. So we tend to talk about rape as if it's something that almost we do. But there's actually a man there who's making a choice. Why don't we talk about that? We also don't talk enough about class and caste. We talk about consequences of rape, but we only talk about certain consequences. For instance, I worked at a rape crisis center for several years, and people assume that victims come and they have many sexual problems, which often happens. You have problems with sex because the two are, in fact, connected, even though they're not the same thing. But we don't talk about all the other ways in which you can have problems. For instance, when I started writing the book, I told a friend of mine, I'm writing this book on rape, and for my research, I'm just telling everyone I know that I'm writing this book and seeing what happens. And she said, I just met a dentist, and this dentist specializes in rape victims and torture victims because it's so difficult for people who've been through certain kinds of trauma to go to the dentist. And this really resonated with me because actually that had happened to me. I never minded going to the gynecologist, but I hated going to the dentist. For some reason, I just had flashbacks every time. And so I've had an entire chapter on dentistry in my rape book. So it just became this organic book. And then I met another friend who said, oh, you must meet my friend Yasmin. She's visiting from Egypt. She began a vigilante group that saved women from rapes by mobs in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring. And so then I knew I had to write a chapter on heroes, on people who don't just choose not to do violence, but who go in and intervene and help. Then I interviewed many, many men, women, trans women, rich people, poor people, sex workers. And one thing that everyone had a story of telling someone they loved. I'm sure that this is familiar to you. And they said, well, what did you expect? Why did you open the door? What did you expect? Why did you go to that club? So then I had to write a chapter called What Did You Expect? And so I actually I loved writing the book. I loved writing the book because it made me realize that rape is so connected to everything else. And as I've gone around the world, the discussion has morphed into things like consent and sexuality and why we're so scared to sometimes talk about rape and sex at the same time. And my theory is it's because often when we talk about sex, especially like in the Indian context, we are in fact talking about rape. When you think about arranged marriage and young girls and old men, what is that wedding night? Is it sex or is it rape? So I think we do need to explore these nuances a lot, and I've tried to start to do that, and I'm excited to talk about it with you too. Oh, and I wanted to just read one small bit, because one of the things about rape is that we think of it as so big that we're scared to talk about it at all. And so we don't, and that does a real disservice to victims and perpetrators, because perpetrators can hide. And I see that there's 10 minutes left, so I'm not going to read, but we're going to talk instead. I actually wanted to start off by asking about silence and the power of words, because I noticed when I was reading a book, in my book I've written, at one stage I've written, here I am, still talking. And you have almost the same sentence. You've written, and here I am, alive, still speaking. And you're speaking for people whose words you've taken and made into really music. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what words do for this crime.
I mean, I think it might be the writer Judith Herman, who talks in Trauma and Recovery about how rape is a crime that annihilates language. And I think that was one of the things that took me so long to write about these experiences, is that how do you narrativize, how do you turn something into a narrative that defies language, that doesn't make sense, that you can't convey the sort of horror of the experience, but how do we understand anything except through language? And so it took me a really long time to just be able to try to convey that, because one of the things I noticed is one of the first things I did when writing my memoir, not this book of essays, but the previous book, The Other Side. When I finally decided, okay, I'm going to write this book, I've known that I was going to write this book for a while, now I'm going to write it. I asked to have the police reports from my case sent to me. And it was, very eerie reading them, because the story that I told the police officers was almost word for word the story that I still told people whenever, it was like the sort of time in my relationship with that person to tell them what had happened to me. It was almost like verbatim, this thing happened, and I don't remember now the script, but there was almost a script for it. And I realized I have never really told the story of it, even though I have this little sentence or two that I say to indicate the kind of the surface of, the lake of trauma that that exists. I haven't really told the story, and so I wanted to do that in The Other Side. And I've since spent a lot more time thinking and talking about it, about silence and the function of silence and the way that shame works to silence people, and how people are told, women and rape victims are told, if you tell anyone about this, it will bring shame upon you, upon your house, upon your family. But that's a lie, because what it actually does is protect the perpetrator and a whole system and culture of rape and and violence. Because if we don't tell what has happened to us, then there's no one to blame, and we can continue to sort of spin this narrative that that the few people who do come forward are liars, right? That they're making it up, they have something to gain, they're trying to get rich. Because the few times that we have a glimpse of the scale of this epidemic, it's terrifying. I'll say one more quick thing about that. And it has to do with Freud, actually. So one of the first things that Freud published was the etiology of hysteria. And this is a study of women who had been diagnosed with hysteria, which was a very common diagnosis, right? And he, in the course of his study, he learned that under every single diagnosis of hysteria was an early sexual trauma. and that these symptoms that they were calling hysteria was in fact post-traumatic stress disorder, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. And he wrote this study and saying, like, underneath all of this hysteria is sexual violence. It's a remarkable study, but what's unfortunate is that there was such a backlash, and he also understood, like, began after it had been published to realize just what it meant. Because if there's this epidemic of hysteria, it means there's this epidemic of sexual violence, and it touches every strata of society, including his own family. I believe his sister had been diagnosed with hysteria, and so what does that mean in my own family? And he recanted and said that can't possibly be true. And instead offered the hypothesis that instead of hysteria, that it was actually a fantasy of rape. That under this epidemic of sexual violence, it had been recast as a sort of epidemic of women's false accusations against men. And I think we can see the way that operates still, even very recently, with the confirmation hearing of a certain Supreme Court justice.
It's so funny that you mentioned hysteria, because I was just thinking about how dissonant it is that we sit up here being very dispassionate about the subject and not really being able to convey the hysteria and the effort that goes into being that dispassionate and almost being cold in our perspective when we talk about this. The distancing, whether it's through persona, which is what I did, or sort of like what you were reading, the excerpt you read from, about being aware of the audience and the interaction that's happening there. That's sort of largely a silent one. So I just think that there's something to be said about how, touching on what you were saying, how much effort women have to make to be dispassionate about a subject that is actually really violent, painful, horrific, and hysteria making. And then I guess actually I think that's all I want to say. Oh, I guess what I wanted to say is that my interest in terms of thinking about silence was really about wanting to get into this psychic landscape of somebody who had undergone, especially rape during wartime, which I think is a very particular kind of sexual violence, and how so much of what's happening is interior. And there was a podcast where they discussed my book, and it was really interesting because there were a couple of people on the podcast, and one of them basically criticized me for making the stories of women beautiful. And I thought that was really interesting, because I thought, where does it say anywhere that a woman who has undergone violence is not capable of beautiful thoughts? And I think there's something about, when I'm thinking about silence, I'm also thinking about how to translate silence into something, like you said, that speaks to a subject that's this unwieldy.
I think we're almost, but I'll quickly say, for me, I feel like words are the only thing that save us. Words are what sets us apart from everything else, and words are what break us as well. I mean, I'm sure you have the same experience. While the things that the men said to me while they were raping me hurt almost more than what they were actually doing physically. And I actually don't feel dispassionate. I feel really passionate, and I feel like the words have helped me to be. I feel like if you pick up my book and read it, you will know that there's beauty and there's joy and there's rage, and all these things can exist in all of us, and we can put words to them because we're human beings, and that's what we do. So I feel like this silence, I actually feel really triumphant that we can be up here, sitting here with our lipstick on, talking about this, because it's like a victory. It's a victory for all of us to be able to do that. I'm alive today because I promised these rapists that I would never tell a soul. They had a knife to my throat, and that's what I promised them, and so they let me go. So I'm rather thrilled that my book is in 6 languages now, because I've broken my promise. So I feel like we do need to talk about it. And yes, it's hard to express, but we express many other things. War, genocide, murder, rape is one of those awful things. And now we have to stop and take questions.
I'm actually going to jump in while somebody's thinking of a question. Because I think yes, we are sitting up here triumphantly with our own voices telling these stories. But relating to your question about silence, one thing that is difficult to say is that, you had to promise to not name those men, right? And in none of my works have I named the man who did this to me. And one of the, I think, last barriers is yes, women are coming forward and talking about their stories in increasing numbers, especially here in the United States following Me Too. But it still remains hard to name the men who are doing this. And we're getting more and more reliable numbers about the number of women who, to use the passive construction, are raped. But we still don't know how many men rape. Who are the men who are doing these, who are perpetuating this violence on the bodies of women and men, and I think that's one of the last remaining barriers, one of the things that remains silent.
You can yell.
Okay. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. In the process of writing, all three of you writing your books and your words, how attached have you become to the topic, and how detached have you become to the topic of rape?
Shall I go? I don't think, for me, it's been so long. It was so much not about me, the book. I mean, the topic has always fascinated me. And I think I resisted that for a long time because I felt like, especially in India, I was being pigeonholed as the rape victim. But then I realized that if that was a pigeonhole, most of us would be in it in one way or the other. So I just decided to let it go. So I actually I thought that the book would get it out of my system. But in fact, it's drawn me in, I think, in a very positive way, because it's led to all these discussions. I was just in the Netherlands, and one of the panels I was on the title of the panel was "Who Owns a Woman's Body?" And there was a sexologist there was somebody else there was a journalist, and it became this really interesting discussion about sex and agency. So I feel like, in a way, I've become attached to it, but in a way that has made me see how sexual violence is so connected with all these things we think about or don't think about, like sexual pleasure, like sex work, like saying no, saying yes, dating mores, the roles of boys, how do we raise our girls. So I feel like it's really expanded my world.
I think it's interesting because when I first got invited to do this panel, I didn't want to do it because I feel like what I have to say about it in my first book and my second book, and I think for me poetry is the form that allows the most kind of complexity. And at the same time, I think it's an important topic, but I do feel a kind of, just personally speaking, sometimes exhausted being the one invited out to talk about rape or to talk about, especially with regards to a book of poetry. I put a lot of formal effort into writing poems, for example. So I think sometimes I feel a kind of exhaustion with it. And I also think that I don't know about y'all, but what we're doing up here isn't that easy. Like, I'm going to go back to my hotel room and process this conversation. And that, again, takes a kind of effort. It's not, and I was sort of curious about what y'all are doing here, because if I had a choice, I would be at the other panel, personally. And so I think it's fascinating that folks show up continually to kind of think about this subject, maybe with a kind of willingness, or maybe with a kind of, I think it's important, I want to know more about it, maybe that's why. But I do feel I've gone on to write about other things, and yet at the same time, I don't think that I will, I remain, I think, really grateful, particularly to the women who shared their stories, and I think the bond between me and them feels like a thing that I'm invested in, even if I'm no longer necessarily specifically invested in writing about the topic of rape.
I will say, I wonder about, and this is in no way an accusation or criticism, but I wonder about your use of the term attached. Like, I am not at all attached to rape. It has attached itself to me. I have written now 2 books about rape. I really hope to never write about it ever again. But I find myself being asked to a lot. Or there's something in the news that's happening and no one is saying the thing that I feel like needs to be said, and I am compelled to. This book of essays is not exclusively about rape. It is also about environmental justice, or violence against the environment, racial violence. Yeah, watch out, ladies. Stay in your place. It's about many other kinds of violences, and consistently the only thing that I'm asked about is about rape. And so I think it's not necessarily me that wants to be talking about this. I'm with Tarfia. Like, this is work, and I feel already very tired, emotionally tired. This is emotional work, to be having this conversation, and I wish that we didn't have to continue having it. But the problem isn't going to go away when I go to bed,
I will say, though, that one thing that has been a surprise to me during all this is that the level of strength and optimism that I have come across. I mean, I really expected when I started interviewing victims, I interviewed victims all over the world, men, women, trans people, child sexual abuse, all kinds of people. And I was expecting it's heavy. You sit with people's pain. It's heavy at readings. People talk about their stories. But more than heavy, I was just amazed at the resilience. I mean, I'm not special because I was raped and sitting up here. I'm only special because we made a certain kind of art out of it. It's a really ordinary thing, and the world is full of ordinary people living with so much pain and doing it so gracefully and so gorgeously. So yes, it's exhausting, but it's also really exhilarating. And also to see the people around. Like, I think of my father, who's just basically God. He was just amazing. And there are many people like him. I heard story after story of terrible, unsupporting, awful people, but also story after story of people who care and who have the respect and who want to. So it's really both. It's just intense on either end. And yeah, who wants to talk about, and especially at parties. People say, what are you writing about? And you say rape, and it's like there's a circle around you of space. But I think our time is up.